Lost dog leads police to missing child. What happens next is truly inspiring. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across the empty streets. Max, a medium-sized dog with a white and brown coat and tired eyes, trotted along the sidewalk, his movements slow and deliberate. His ribs were visible beneath his fur, a testament to the days or perhaps weeks he had spent wandering without a home. His collar, once a bright shade of blue, was now faded and frayed. Dangling from it was a small tag with a name, though the letters had become almost unreadable over time. Max's journey had brought him here, though he didn't know where here was. All he knew was that he needed food, water, and, most importantly, someone to notice him. His ears perked up at the sound of a distant siren, and he turned his head to see a police car parked at the edge of the neighborhood. Two officers stood nearby, their faces serious as they spoke in low voices. The sight of the officers stirred something in Max. He couldn't explain it, but he felt an urge to approach them, as if they could understand what he needed or what he could offer. With cautious steps, he made his way toward the car, his tail wagging hesitantly. One of the officers, a tall man with kind eyes and a name tag that read Daniels, noticed him first. "Hey, buddy," Officer Daniels said, crouching down as Max came closer. "What are you doing out here all alone?" Max let out a soft bark, his tail wagging faster now. He nudged Daniels' hand with his nose, then looked toward the woods at the edge of the neighborhood. Daniels frowned, sensing something unusual in the dog's behavior. "Does he seem different to you?" Daniels asked his partner, Officer Ramirez, who was standing nearby. Ramirez glanced at Max, then shrugged. "Probably just a stray looking for food. Poor guy looks like he hasn't eaten in days." But Daniels wasn't convinced. There was something in Max's eyes, a sense of urgency, almost as if he were trying to say something. Daniels reached out to pat Max's head, and the dog responded by barking again, more insistently this time. He turned toward the woods, looking back at the officers as if urging them to follow. "You see that?" Daniels said, standing up. "I think he's trying to lead us somewhere." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "You really think a stray dog knows something we don't?" "I don't know," Daniels admitted, "but it's worth checking out. We've got nothing else right now." The missing child case had been weighing heavily on the department. Ethan, a 7-year-old boy with a bright smile and an adventurous spirit, had disappeared 2 days ago while playing in his backyard. Despite extensive searches and numerous tips from the community, there had been no sign of him. The thought of another night without answers was unbearable. Daniels grabbed his flashlight from the patrol car and motioned for Ramirez to follow. "Let's see where this dog takes us," he said. Max barked again, his tail wagging as he led the way into the woods. The officers exchanged a glance before following, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. The woods were dense, the tall trees casting long shadows in the fading light. Max moved with purpose, his nose low to the ground as he navigated the terrain. Daniels couldn't help but marvel at the dog's determination. It was as if Max knew exactly where he was going. "You think this is crazy?" Daniels asked, his voice low. "Absolutely," Ramirez replied. "But at this point, I'm willing to try anything." As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the neighborhood faded into silence. Max paused occasionally, sniffing the air before continuing. Each time he stopped, Daniels felt his heart race, wondering if they were about to find something, anything, that could lead them to Ethan. The deeper they went into the woods, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of branches as Max pushed forward. Officer Daniels kept his flashlight steady, its beam cutting through the shadows. Max's urgency hadn't wavered, and Daniels found himself trusting the dog more with each step. "Do you think this is leading somewhere? Or are we just following a stray through the woods?" Ramirez muttered, his skepticism clear but his pace unwavering. Daniels glanced back at him. "Look at him. He's not wandering aimlessly. He knows where he's going. I think we have to trust him. Max suddenly stopped, his ears perking up as he sniffed the air. His body tensed, and he let out a low, deliberate bark. Daniels froze, his flashlight sweeping the area ahead. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice calm but alert. Max barked again and took off, darting through a dense patch of trees. Daniels and Ramirez exchanged a quick glance before following, their adrenaline spiking as they tried to keep up. The terrain grew trickier, with fallen branches and uneven ground slowing their progress. But Max was relentless. "Where is he taking us?" Ramirez asked, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "Let's find out," Daniels replied, his focus on the dog's shadowy figure ahead. After a few minutes, Max came to an abrupt stop at the base of a large oak tree. He barked loudly, his front paws scratching at the ground as if trying to dig. Daniels approached cautiously, shining his flashlight on the area Max was fixated on. At first, there was nothing unusual, just dirt, leaves, and scattered rocks. But then Daniels noticed something half buried in the ground. A small blue shoe. Daniels crouched down, his heart pounding as he carefully unearthed the shoe. It was muddy and worn, but unmistakable. "It's Ethan's," he said, holding it up for Ramirez to see. Ramirez's face darkened. "Are you sure?" Daniels nodded. His parents described it perfectly, blue with a white stripe. "This has to be it." Max barked again, his nose pressed to the ground as he began circling the area. Daniels stood, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "He's still leading us. Let's keep going." The discovery reignited their hope, and the two officers followed Max with renewed determination. The dog's pace quickened, his barks growing louder as if urging them to hurry. The woods grew denser, the trees pressing closer together, but Max navigated the terrain with ease. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. At its center stood an old, weathered cabin, its roof partially caved in and its windows dark. Max stopped at the edge of the clearing, his tail wagging furiously as he looked back at the officers. Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. "Ramirez, radio for backup," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We might have found something." As Ramirez called for reinforcements, Daniels approached the cabin cautiously. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, and he pressed his ear to the door, listening for any sign of movement inside. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, he heard it, a soft, muffled sound, almost like a whimper. Daniel's heart leapt. "There's someone in there," he whispered, motioning for Ramirez to join him. Together, they pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The inside of the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp wood. Daniels swept his flashlight across the room, his eyes scanning for any sign of Ethan. The whimpering grew louder, leading him to a corner where a pile of old blankets lay. As Daniels approached, the blankets shifted, and a small, trembling figure emerged. It was Ethan. His face was pale, his clothes dirty, and his eyes wide with fear, but he was alive. Daniels dropped to his knees, his voice gentle as he said, "Ethan, it's okay. We're here to take you home." Ethan's gaze flicked to Max, who was standing beside Daniels, his tail wagging softly. The boy's lips trembled, and he whispered, "He found me." Daniels felt a lump rise in his throat. "That's right, buddy. Max found you. You're safe now." Ramirez stepped forward, wrapping a blanket around Ethan as Daniels radioed for medical assistance. The boy clung to Max, his small hands gripping the dog's fur as if he were afraid to let go. Max seemed to understand, his body still and calm as Ethan leaned against him. The sound of sirens filled the air as backup arrived, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Paramedics rushed to examine Ethan, but the boy refused to let go of Mac. "He stayed with me," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't leave me." Daniels placed a hand on Max's head, his voice filled with emotion. "You're a hero, Mac." Back at the station, Ethan was reunited with his parents, who wept with relief as they hugged their son. The story of Max's incredible instincts spread quickly, capturing the attention of the entire community. Reporters flocked to the station, eager to share the tale of the lost dog who had become a hero. Max, however, seemed oblivious to the attention. He stayed close to Ethan, his calm presence a source of comfort for the boy. Daniels watched the two of them, his heart full as he realized just how extraordinary Max truly was. "This dog," Daniels said to Ramirez, shaking his head in amazement. "He's something special." The next step was figuring out where Max had come from. A trip to the local vet revealed an old collar tag hidden beneath the layers of dirt and grime. The letters were faint but still legible. Max and an address on the other side of town. Daniels felt a pang of sadness as he realized Max might have a family waiting for him. But before they could take Max home, Ethan's parents made a heartfelt plea. "If Max doesn't have an owner," Ethan's mother said, her voice thick with emotion, "we'd love to give him a home. He saved our son. He's already part of our family." The next day, Officer Daniels drove Max across town to the address on his old collar tag. Max sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, ears flapping in the breeze. Daniels couldn't help but feel a pang of worry. What if Max's owner didn't want him back? Or worse, what if they didn't deserve him? After everything Max had done, he deserved the best possible life. The address led them to a small, weathered house at the edge of town. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the shutters was peeling. Daniels parked the car and stepped out, Max following close behind. As they approached the front door, an elderly woman appeared on the porch, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the dog. "Max," she said, her voice trembling. She took a cautious step forward, her hands clutching the railing for support. "Is that really you?" Max barked and bounded up the steps, his tail wagging furiously. The woman dropped to her knees, wrapping her frail arms around him as tears streamed down her face. "I thought I'd lost you forever," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I looked everywhere for you after the storm." Daniels watched the reunion in silence, his heart swelling at the sight. He waited until the woman composed herself before introducing himself. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Daniels. Max here has been through quite the adventure." The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Harper, invited them inside. She explained how Max had gone missing months ago during a severe thunderstorm. "He must have gotten scared and run off," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I put up posters called shelters, everything. But after weeks with no sign of him, I thought," her words trailed off as she wiped her eyes. Daniels nodded sympathetically. "He's been through a lot, but he's also done something extraordinary. Max helped us find a missing child, a little boy named Ethan who was lost in the woods. If it weren't for him, we might not have found him in time." Mrs. Harper gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "My Max did that?" Daniels smiled. "Yes, ma'am. He's a hero." Mrs. Harper looked down at Max, who was sitting at her feet, his tail thumping against the floor. "You've always had a big heart," she said, stroking his fur. "Even as a puppy, you couldn't stand to see anyone in trouble." Daniels explained Ethan's family's offer to adopt Max if Mrs. Harper was unable to care for him. The suggestion brought a flicker of pain to her eyes, but she nodded thoughtfully. "I'm so grateful they want to give him a home," she said, "but Max is my family. He's all I have left." Hearing the conviction in her voice, Daniels realized that Mrs. Harper needed Max as much as he needed her. "I understand," he said gently, "and I'm sure Ethan's family will too." Before he left, Daniels gave Mrs. Harper his card, promising to stay in touch. "If you ever need anything," he said, "don't hesitate to call." Back at the station, Daniels explained the situation to Ethan and his family. While they were disappointed, they understood the bond between Max and Mrs. Harper. Ethan, who had grown deeply attached to Max in the short time they'd spent together, insisted on writing a letter to thank him. The next day, Daniels delivered the letter to Mrs. Harper's house. It was written in a child's messy handwriting, the words simple but heartfelt. "Dear Max, thank you for finding me. You're the best dog in the world. I'll never forget you. Love, Ethan." Mrs. Harper read the letter aloud, tears filling her eyes. She promised to frame it and hang it in the living room as a reminder of Max's bravery. As the weeks passed, Max settled back into life with Mrs. Harper, but he didn't disappear from Ethan's life entirely. Mrs. Harper, touched by Ethan's gratitude, arranged for regular visits. Every Saturday, Ethan and his parents would come to the house, bringing treats and toys for Max. The boy and the dog would play in the yard, their bond growing stronger with each visit. The story of Max's heroics spread throughout the town, capturing the hearts of everyone who heard it. Local newspapers ran articles about the hero dog, and a few weeks later, a regional TV station aired a segment featuring interviews with Officer Daniels, Mrs. Harper, and Ethan's family. Max, of course, remained blissfully unaware of his newfound fame. For him, life was about simple joys: chasing a ball in the yard, napping in the sun, and spending time with the people he loved. Mrs. Harper, revitalized by Max's return, began venturing out more, often bringing him along to the park or the local farmer's market. One day, while walking in the park, they were approached by a group of children who had recognized Max from the news. "Is that the hero dog?" one of them asked, their eyes wide with awe. Mrs. Harper smiled. "Yes, this is Mac." The children crowded around, petting Max and asking questions about his adventure. Mrs. Harper told them about the day Max led the officers to Ethan, her voice filled with pride. "He's a very special dog," she said, "and he has a very special heart." As time went on, Max's story continued to inspire the community. The local animal shelter saw an increase in adoptions, with many people citing Max as their reason for wanting to give a stray a home. The police department even started a program called Max's Mission, encouraging officers to work with shelter dogs in search and rescue training. Officer Daniels, who had formed a special bond with Max during the rescue, became a frequent visitor to Mrs. Harper's house. He would bring treats for Max and spend hours talking with Mrs. Harper about her life and the adventures she'd had with Max before the storm. Their conversations often drifted to the future, with Daniels sharing his hope of expanding Max's mission to neighboring towns. For Mrs. Harper, Max's return had given her a new lease on life. She started volunteering at the animal shelter, helping to care for the dogs and sharing Max's story with potential adopters. Her once quiet house was now filled with laughter, visitors, and the sound of Max's happy barks. And for Ethan, Max became more than a hero. He became a symbol of hope and resilience. The boy often spoke about the day Max found him, his eyes lighting up as he described the dog's courage. "Max didn't just save me," he told his classmates during show and tell. "He taught me that heroes can be anyone, even a dog." As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Max, Mrs. Harper, Ethan, and the entire community grew even stronger. The small town, which had once been like any other, began to embrace Max's story as a part of its identity. The hero dog became a beloved figure, and everywhere Mrs. Harper went, people stopped to greet Max and share their admiration. One day, the mayor of the town approached Mrs. Harper with a proposal. "We'd like to honor Max and his incredible bravery with a special event," he said. "Something that brings the whole town together and celebrates everything he's done for us." Mrs. Harper, though initially hesitant about the attention, eventually agreed. She knew Max's story had inspired so many people, and she wanted to share his light with as many as possible. Plans were made for a town festival, complete with games, food, and a ceremony to unveil a special surprise. On the day of the festival, the town square was transformed into a lively hub of activity. Stalls lined the streets, offering everything from handmade crafts to delicious treats. Children ran around with balloons, many of them wearing shirts with Max's face printed on them. Banners reading, "Celebrating Max, our hero dog," hung across the square, and a stage had been set up for the main event. Mrs. Harper arrived with Max in tow, the dog's tail wagging as he soaked in the attention. Ethan and his family were among the first to greet them, and the boy wrapped his arms around Max's neck. "I told all my friends about you," Ethan said proudly. "They all think you're the coolest dog ever." Max responded with a happy bark, licking Ethan's cheek and making him giggle. Mrs. Harper watched the interaction with a warm smile, her heart full at the sight of the bond between the two. As the festival reached its peak, the mayor took the stage to address the crowd. "Today, we come together to celebrate a truly remarkable member of our community," he began, his voice carrying across the square. "Max's bravery not only saved a life but reminded us all of the power of courage, love, and connection. He's more than a dog. He's a symbol of what makes this town special." The crowd erupted into applause as the mayor motioned for Mrs. Harper and Max to join him on stage. Mrs. Harper, though slightly nervous, walked up with Max by her side. Ethan, unable to contain his excitement, followed closely behind. The mayor smiled warmly as he continued. "Max's actions have inspired us to be better, to look out for one another, to show kindness, and to never give up hope. And so, it's only fitting that we honor him in a way that ensures his story will never be forgotten." He gestured to a large covered object at the edge of the stage. With a dramatic flourish, the cover was removed, revealing a bronze statue of Max, standing proudly with his tail raised high. At his feet was a small plaque that read, "Max, a hero's heart, a town's inspiration." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Mrs. Harper wiped away tears as she looked at the statue. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her hand resting on Max's head. The dog tilted his head as if to say he understood, his tail wagging furiously. The celebration continued late into the evening, with stories of Max being shared around the square. People who had been inspired by his story came forward to thank Mrs. Harper and share their experiences. One woman, a local teacher, explained how her class had started a project about kindness and bravery. "Inspired by Max, he's taught us all so much," she said, "especially the kids." Ethan's family, too, expressed their gratitude once more. "Max didn't just save Ethan," his mother said. "He saved all of us. He brought us back together when we thought we'd lost everything." For Mrs. Harper, the day was bittersweet. She was proud of Max and grateful for the community's love, but she couldn't help but think about the stormy night when she'd thought she'd lost him forever. "You've come a long way, Max," she said softly as they walked home that evening. "And you've brought so much good into this world." Back at home, Max curled up at her feet as she sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street. The town felt different now, warmer, closer, and more connected. Mrs. Harper knew that Max's story had played a big part in that. In the weeks that followed, Max's fame continued to grow. News outlets picked up his story, and soon, letters and messages poured in from people across the country. Many shared how Max's bravery had inspired them to adopt pets, volunteer at shelters, or simply be kinder to those around them. One particularly touching letter came from a young boy who had been struggling with loneliness. "Hearing about Max made me feel like I wasn't alone," he wrote. "If a dog can be so brave, maybe I can be brave too." Mrs. Harper read each letter aloud to Max, who would wag his tail as if he understood the impact he had made. "You're changing lives, Max," she told him one evening. "You're reminding people that there's always hope." Despite his newfound fame, Max remained the same loyal, loving dog he had always been. He spent his days by Mrs. Harper's side, accompanying her on walks, visits to the animal shelter, and quiet evenings at home. He continued to visit Ethan regularly, their bond as strong as ever. Together, they played, explored, and shared moments of pure joy. Ethan often asked Mrs. Harper about Max's past, curious about the adventures he might have had before the storm. "Do you think he's always been a hero?" he asked one day, scratching Max behind the ears. Mrs. Harper smiled. "I think Max has always had a big heart. He just needed the right moment to show it." As the seasons changed, the town continued to honor Max's legacy. The park where he had been reunited with Mrs. Harper was renamed Max's Meadow, and the annual festival became a cherished tradition. Each year, the community gathered to celebrate acts of kindness and courage, inspired by the dog who had brought them all together. For Mrs. Harper, every day with Max was a gift. She often found herself marveling at how much her life had changed since his return. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "You've reminded me of what it means to love and be loved, As Max grew older, his pace slowed, and his fur began to gray. But his spirit remained as strong as ever, and his bond with Mrs. Harper only deepened. Together, they continued to share their story, spreading hope and inspiration wherever they went. The town, too, carried Max's legacy forward. His statue in the square became a symbol of resilience and compassion, a reminder that even the smallest actions could make a difference. And for those who knew him best, Max wasn't just a hero, he was family. As the years rolled on, Max's story became more than a tale. It turned into a legend in the small town. School children learned about him as part of their curriculum, drawing pictures of him in art class and reenacting his heroic rescue during school plays. His name became synonymous with bravery and loyalty, a reminder that even a lost dog could change the lives of so many. Mrs. Harper watched all of this unfold with a quiet pride. Though Max remained blissfully unaware of the fame surrounding him, she often told him stories of how his actions had inspired others. "You're more than a hero, Max," she would say, stroking his fur. "You're proof that love and courage can come from the most unexpected places." One crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Harper received a letter in the mail. The envelope was marked with the seal of a well-known publishing house, and the letter inside contained an extraordinary proposal. The publishing company wanted to turn Max's story into a children's book, complete with illustrations and a message of hope for young readers. Mrs. Harper was taken aback. The idea of sharing Max's story with children across the country filled her with joy, but she also felt a pang of hesitation. "This isn't just my story to tell," she said to herself, glancing at Max, who was napping in his favorite spot by the window. That evening, she called Ethan's parents to share the news. They were thrilled at the idea and encouraged her to move forward. "Max's story has already touched so many lives," Ethan's mother said. "This book could inspire even more people." With their blessing, Mrs. Harper agreed to the project. Over the next several months, she worked closely with a writer and an illustrator, sharing every detail of Max's journey, from the storm that separated them to the miraculous rescue of Ethan. The book, titled Max, the dog who saved a life, was a labor of love, and Mrs. Harper poured her heart into every page. When the book was finally published, it was an instant success. Parents across the country read it to their children at bedtime. Teachers used it to spark discussions about kindness and courage, and shelters saw an increase in adoptions as families were inspired by Max's story. One day, Mrs. Harper received a package in the mail. Inside was a copy of the book, its pages filled with heartfelt letters and drawings from children who had read it. One letter stood out to her. "Dear Mrs. Harper and Max, I used to be scared to talk to people because I thought I wasn't good enough. But when I read about Max, I realized that being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It just means you do the right thing anyway. Thank you for teaching me that. Love, Lily." Tears filled Mrs. Harper's eyes as she read the letter aloud to Max. "You're changing lives. Even from here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Max wagged his tail as if he understood. As Max grew older, the pace of their days slowed, but the love between them remained as strong as ever. Mrs. Harper cherished every moment with him, from their morning walks to their quiet evenings by the fire. Max, ever loyal, stayed by her side, his presence a constant source of comfort and joy. Ethan, now a teenager, continued to visit regularly. Though he was busier with school and activities, he always made time for Max. The bond between them had only deepened over the years, and Ethan often spoke of how Max had inspired him to pursue his dream of becoming a veterinarian. "I want to help animals the way Max helped me," Ethan said one day as he sat on the porch with Mrs. Harper. "He's the reason I want to make a difference." Hearing this, Mrs. Harper felt a deep sense of pride. Max's story had not only saved Ethan, but had set him on a path to help countless others. It was a legacy that would live on, long after Max's time. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside, Mrs. Harper sat by the fire with Max at her feet. She thought about all the lives he had touched, Ethan's, hers, and so many others. She leaned down, resting a hand on his graying fur. "You've given us all so much, Max," she whispered. "You've shown us what it means to be truly brave." Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with the quiet wisdom that only a dog could have. He leaned into her touch, his tail wagging gently, and Mrs. Harper felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. In the following spring, the town hosted another festival to celebrate Max's legacy. This time, the event was even larger, drawing people from neighboring towns and beyond. The proceeds from the festival were donated to animal shelters and rescue organizations, ensuring that Max's impact would continue to grow. At the heart of the festival was a special ceremony. The mayor announced the creation of the Max Award, an annual honor given to individuals or groups who demonstrated extraordinary acts of kindness and bravery. The first recipient was a young girl who had started a pet food drive for local shelters, inspired by Max's story. As the girl accepted her award, she looked out at the crowd and said, "Max showed us that anyone can be a hero, no matter how small or lost they might feel. He's taught us that love and courage are the most important things we can share." The crowd erupted into applause, and Mrs. Harper felt tears welling up in her eyes. She held Max close, whispering, "Look at what you've done, my sweet boy. You've made the world a better place." In the years that followed, Max's story continued to inspire. His book became a classic, cherished by generations of children and families. The annual festival grew into a beloved tradition, and the Max Award became a symbol of hope and compassion. For Mrs. Harper, the greatest joy was knowing that Max's legacy would live on. Though he had started as a lost dog, wandering the streets with no home or direction, he had become a beacon of light for so many. As Max entered his twilight years, Mrs. Harper ensured that every moment was filled with love and comfort. They spent their days enjoying the simple pleasures of life, watching the sunset, walking through the park, and sharing quiet moments by the fire. And though Max's steps were slower and his fur was grayer, his spirit remained as bright as ever. One summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mrs. Harper sat on the porch with Max at her side. She thought about the journey they had shared, their struggles, their triumphs, and the incredible bond that had brought them together. "You've given me more than I ever could have dreamed," she said softly. "Thank you, Max, for everything." Max rested his head on her lap, his tail wagging gently. And in that moment, Mrs. Harper knew that their story was one of love, resilience, and the power of a single act of bravery to change the world. Here's the final batch of 1,500 words to conclude the story. As Max's twilight years turned into quiet, peaceful days, Mrs. Harper focused on making every moment special for him. The town continued to embrace Max as their hero, and visitors from across the country came to meet the dog whose story had touched their hearts. But for Mrs. Harper, Max wasn't just a hero, he was family. One spring morning, the two of them sat on the porch, basking in the gentle warmth of the sun. Birds chirped in the distance, and a soft breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Max lay by Mrs. Harper's feet, his tail wagging lazily as he watched the world go by. "You've lived quite the life, haven't you, Max?" Mrs. Harper said, leaning down to scratch behind his ears. "From a scared little stray to a legend. But to me, you'll always just be my Mac." As the seasons changed, so did Max. His steps became slower, his naps longer, and his once bounding energy gave way to a serene calmness. Mrs. Harper cherished these moments, knowing their time together was precious. She often found herself reminiscing about the day she found Max on her porch, a frightened but hopeful pup who had brought light back into her life. Ethan continued to visit regularly, now a young man preparing to leave for college. During one of his final visits before moving away, he sat on the porch with Mrs. Harper and Max, his eyes filled with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without him," Ethan said, stroking Max's fur. "He taught me what it means to never give up." Mrs. Harper smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "He's taught us all so much," she said softly, "and he'll always be with us. No matter where life takes us." Ethan promised to visit often and send updates about his studies. True to his word, he wrote letters and sent photos from college, sharing stories of how Max's legacy continued to inspire him. He volunteered at local animal shelters, helping to care for abandoned pets and sharing Max's story with anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, the town's annual Max Festival grew larger each year, attracting visitors from far and wide. The event became a celebration of kindness and courage, with proceeds supporting shelters, rescue organizations, and community programs. Max's statue in the park became a symbol of hope, and people often left flowers, letters, and small tokens at its base. One crisp autumn evening, Mrs. Harper sat by the fire, Max curled up at her feet. She held a photo album filled with memories of their time together. Pictures of Max as a playful pup, photos from the festival, and candid shots of him with Ethan. As she flipped through the pages, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they had shared. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me what it means to love and be loved." Max lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers with a look of understanding. He nuzzled her hand, his tail wagging softly. Mrs. Harper leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "You're my hero, Max," she whispered. "Always." One morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, Mrs. Harper awoke to find Max lying peacefully by her bed. His breathing was slow and steady, his body relaxed. She sat beside him, stroking his fur and speaking softly, recounting the many adventures they had shared. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Max took one final breath, his body still and his expression calm. Mrs. Harper felt a wave of sorrow but also a profound sense of peace. Max had lived a full, beautiful life, surrounded by love and celebrated by all who knew him. News of Max's passing spread quickly through the town, and the outpouring of love was overwhelming. Letters, flowers, and messages of support flooded Mrs. Harper's home, and the community rallied around her in her time of grief. The mayor declared a day of remembrance for Max, inviting everyone to the park for a special ceremony. On the day of the event, the town square was filled with people, their faces a mix of sadness and gratitude. Ethan, who had returned from college for the occasion, stood beside Mrs. Harper, holding her hand as they looked out at the crowd. The mayor took the stage, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Max was more than a dog. He was a symbol of everything good in this world. His bravery, his loyalty, and his boundless love reminded us all of what it means to truly care for one another. Today, we honor his memory and the legacy he has left behind. As the mayor finished speaking, Ethan stepped forward, holding a small plaque. His voice trembled as he addressed the crowd. "Max didn't just save my life, he changed it. He taught me to believe in hope, even in the darkest times. And he showed us all that even the smallest actions can make a difference." He turned to Mrs. Harper, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for sharing Max with us. He'll always be our hero." The crowd erupted into applause as Ethan presented the plaque to Mrs. Harper. Inscribed on it were the words, "In loving memory of Max, a dog who taught us to be better." As the years passed, Max's legacy continued to grow. The annual festival evolved into a nationwide event, with communities across the country hosting their own celebrations of kindness and bravery. The book about Max's story became a bestseller, translated into multiple languages and cherished by families around the world. Mrs. Harper, though now older and slower herself, continued to honor Max's memory in her own quiet way. She often visited his statue in the park, leaving a flower at its base and sitting on the bench to reflect on their journey together. "You're still with me," she would whisper, "in every moment, in every memory." Ethan, now a veterinarian, carried Max's spirit into his work, dedicating his career to helping animals in need. He often told Max's story to his patients and their families, using it to inspire hope and resilience. On the wall of his clinic hung a photo of Max, along with the plaque from the remembrance ceremony. For Ethan, Max wasn't just a hero, he was a guiding light. "Everything I do for him," he would say, to honor the love and courage he showed us all. In the quiet moments of her life, Mrs. Harper found solace in the knowledge that Max's story would never fade. Though he was gone, his impact remained, a testament to the extraordinary power of love and bravery. One sunny afternoon, as Mrs. Harper walked through the park, she stopped by Max's statue and placed a single flower at its base. She sat on the bench, watching as children played nearby and families gathered to read the story of the hero dog. "You changed everything, Max," she said softly, "and you'll always be with us." As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow across the park, it was clear that Max's legacy was more than a story. It was a reminder of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals and the power of love to transform even the darkest moments. Max's journey, from a lost dog to a hero, had left an indelible mark on the world. And for those who knew him, his memory would live on forever, a beacon of hope and inspiration for generations to come.